Sarah held her youngest child, closed the baby's soft breath against her neck, the only warmth she had felt in days. Her other two children, the boy and the girl, pressed against her legs, their small forms shivering in the cool night air that whispered across the open plain. She was a widow, the burden of her loss heavy in her chest as she stood on the porch of the ranch house, the last of her money spent on the journey that had brought her here. With nothing left but the clothes on their backs and the hope that had carried her across the country, she faced the difficult choice that had led her to this stranger's door. Staying in the east would have meant starvation for her three small children, so she had risked everything to come west. The journey replayed in her mind in quiet fragments. Her husband had fallen ill after a harsh winter, his body wasting away until he was gone, leaving her to face the creditors alone. The farm they had built together was sold to pay the debts, and her relatives had offered no shelter, turning her away with words that still stung. She had packed the carpetbag with what little remained, bought passage on the train with the final coins, and traveled for weeks, the children growing thinner with each passing day. A kind soul on the train had told her of this place of the cowboy who lived alone and had shown unexpected kindness when a stranger left a baby on his porch one night and disappeared into the night without trace. The man had taken the infant in raising it as his own without complaint or question. If he had room in his heart for that one small life, Sarah told herself, perhaps he would have room for her and her three. Her hand trembled as she knocked on the door, the sound cutting through the silence. The baby fussed and she hushed him gently, her voice barely above a whisper. The girl looked up at her with trusting eyes, the boy standing tall as he could, trying to be strong for his sisters and brother. The door opened, and the cowboy stood there, his tall frame filling the doorway. His face was lined with the years of solitary work, his hands rough from rope and saddle. He did not speak, but his eyes met hers, taking in the sight of the tired mother and her children without a word of surprise. He stepped aside, his gesture simple and clear, inviting them into the warmth of the house. Sarah entered, the scent of pine wood and cooked meat wrapping around her like a blanket. The floor was solid beneath her feet, the room sparse but clean with a fire crackling in the hearth. The man moved with quiet efficiency, pulling chairs to the table and setting out bowls. He ladled stew from a pot on the stove, the steam rising in soft curls. He placed a bowl before each child, then broke off pieces of bread and handed them out. The boy ate eagerly. The girl smiled for the first time in days as she dipped the bread into the broth, and the baby took small bites from Sarah's spoon, his cries quieting. The cowboy then brought a pitcher of water, pouring for each of them. When the girl reached out a small hand to touch his arm, he paused, then gently ruffled her hair, a small gesture that spoke volumes in his silence. The children began to relax their bodies, losing the tension of the long road. Sarah watched, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and caution. This man who had taken in the abandoned baby without hesitation now extended the same quiet care to them. As they ate, she felt the weight of her past lift slightly. The scars from her husband's death, the abandonment by those who should have helped, the fear that had driven her across the miles, all seemed a little less sharp in this moment. The man did not ask questions or demand explanations. He simply provided his actions, revealing the depth of a character shaped by the harsh land. Later, he prepared pallets by the fire with extra blankets, arranging them with care. The children settled in, the boy and girl curling up together, the baby in Sarah's arms. The wind outside howled against the windows, but inside the room was a sanctuary. Sarah lay down, her body aching from the journey, yet her mind filled with the first threads of trust. The cowboy sat by the stove for a time, his silhouette against the firelight, before he too prepared to rest. In the quiet, Sarah knew that the life ahead would be hard, but for the first time, it would not be faced alone. The porch that had seen a stranger disappear into the night now held the promise of redemption for her and her children. The days that followed settled into a rhythm as steady as the turning of seasons. Sarah rose before first light, the floorboards cold under her bare feet as she stirred the fire back to life. The cowboy, whose name she learned in the second quiet hour of their first evening together, was Elias moved through the same routines he had kept for years alone. He fed the horses, checked the windmill-hauled water from the spring. He never asked her to help, yet he never turned away when she followed him out into the gray morning. She learned the weight of the wooden yoke across her shoulders, the way the buckets pulled at her palms until they blistered and then calloused. At first, her arms shook and the water sloshed over the rim, darkening the dirt in small, dark moons. Elias watched once, said nothing, then the next morning set a smaller pair of buckets beside the larger ones. She understood the gesture without words and took them. The children trailed after her, sometimes the boy carrying the littlest pail with both hands, proud of the few inches of water he could manage. Elias cooked supper most nights, beans simmered with salt pork cornbread baked in the Dutch oven. Sometimes a rabbit he had snared. He ate standing at the counter, never sitting until the children were fed, and Sarah had taken her place. One evening, the girl whose name was Lila climbed onto the bench beside him and rested her cheek against his arm. He went still fork halfway to his mouth, then slowly lowered it and let her stay. Sarah saw the muscle in his jaw work once, twice before he resumed eating. After that, Lila claimed the spot every night. The boy, Caleb, took longer. He watched Elias from a distance, measuring him the way a colt measures a new fence line. One afternoon, Elias was mending a broken gatepost when Caleb appeared holding a hammer too large for his hand. Elias took it without comment, showed him how to drive a nail straight, then handed the hammer back. Caleb struck 3 clumsy blows before the nail bent. Elias pulled it free with the claw end, set a fresh nail, and waited. The 4th strike went true. Caleb looked up, searching the man's face for approval. Elias gave the smallest nod. That was enough. The baby, Thomas, thrived fastest of all. Elias carried him in the crook of one arm while he checked fence lines or split kindling, the child's tiny fist wrapped around the man's forefinger. Sarah sometimes found them on the porch at dusk, Elias rocking slowly in the old chair, while Thomas slept against his chest. She would stand in the doorway and watch until the ache in her throat eased. Winter crept closer. The wind turned sharp, carrying the scent of snow from the high country. Elias began cutting extra wood, stacking it high against the house. Sarah helped, though her hands bled through the first week. One morning she woke to find new wool mittens on the table. Rough hand knit the stitches uneven, but tight. She slipped them on and felt the warmth of someone else's labor against her skin. In the evenings, they sat by the fire after the children slept. Elias rarely spoke, but once he told her about the land. His father had claimed it 30 years earlier, built the house log by log, died of fever when Elias was 15. He had kept it through drought and grasshopper years, through winters that killed half the herd. He spoke of the place the way a man speaks of a living thing he both loves and fears losing. Sarah listened, then told him haltingly about her husband's long illness, the way the bank took the farm before the body was cold in the ground, the night she had lain awake, counting the coins left in the jar, and knowing they would not be enough. She did not cry. She had used up her tears on the train. But her voice cracked once, and Elias reached across the space between their chairs and laid his hand over hers for 3 heartbeats before drawing it back. Neither of them spoke of love. Love was a word too fragile for the life they were building. Instead, they shared the work, the silence, the small daily proofs that the other would stay. One night, a storm rolled in from the north wind, howling under the eaves like something alive and angry. The children woke frightened. Elias lit the lantern, checked the stock, then returned with snow in his beard and carried extra quilts to the pallets. Sarah rocked Thomas while Elias sat on the floor beside Caleb and Lila, telling them in his low, spare voice about the time his father had ridden through a whiteout to bring a lost calf home. The children listened, eyes wide, until sleep took them again. Sarah met Elias's gaze across the firelight. For the first time, she saw something unguarded in his face, not softness, exactly, but a willingness to be seen. She felt the same willingness rise in herself. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, the house held. The first real trouble came with the spring thaw. The creek that bordered Elias's land rose fast brown and angry, carrying last year's deadfall downstream like matchsticks. One morning, Sarah stepped onto the porch and saw the water already licking the lower pasture. By noon, it had swallowed half the hay meadow. Elias rode out at first light, checking the fence line where the current pressed hardest. When he returned, his coat was soaked to the shoulders, and his face was carved with lines deeper than usual. He said only 2 words at supper banks coming. Sarah felt the spoon go still in her hand. She had known this shadow might follow her. The letter had arrived the week before, folded tight and official, delivered by a man who would not meet her eyes. It named the debt her husband had carried, $340 compounded twice since his death. The bank in Cheyenne had sold the note to a land speculator named Harlan Crow, who now held paper on half the valley's smaller holdings. Crow wanted clear title, clear water, clear grazing. Elias's place sat square on the best spring-fed stretch of the creek. That night, Sarah could not sleep. She lay listening to the children breathe and to the distant roar of the flood. She thought of turning back east, of finding some factory work in a city where no one knew her name. But the thought of pulling the children away from this place, from Elias, felt like tearing skin. The next morning, Elias was gone before dawn. He returned at dusk, leading 2 extra horses borrowed from the McAllister place 5 miles north. He unloaded sacks of seed oats and a coil of new barbed wire. Sarah helped him stack the supplies in the barn. When their hands brushed, reaching for the same sack, neither pulled away at once. Crow arrived 3 days later in a black surrey polished to a mirror shine. 2 men rode with him, hired hands wearing sidearms, and the look of men paid to look dangerous. Crow stayed mounted while he spoke, his voice carrying the flat certainty of money. "Elias, you know why I'm here. The note's due. 30 days or I foreclose. I'll pay fair for the water rights. More than fair." Elias stood in the dooryard, arms loose at his sides. "Land's not for sale." Crow smiled without warmth. "Everything's for sale when the law says it is." Sarah watched from the doorway, Thomas on her hip. Leela and Caleb stood behind her, silent. She felt the old fear coil in her stomach, the same fear that had driven her across half a continent. She stepped forward before she could think better of it. "My husband's debt is mine," she said. "If there's payment to be made, I'll make it." Crow turned his eyes on her, then measuring. "A widow with 3 mouths and no husband. Admirable, but impractical. You can't work this place alone." "I'm not alone," she said. The words hung between them. Elias did not look at her, but she saw the slight lift of his chin. Crow laughed, once short and dry. "Sentiment won't pay taxes or interest. 30 days. He touched his hat brim and turned the team. After the dust settled, Elias walked to the barn without a word. Sarah followed. Inside, he lifted a pitchfork from the rack and began forking hay into the manger's movements, hard and deliberate. She waited until he paused. "I didn't come here to bring this down on you," she said. He set the fork against the wall. "You didn't bring it. Crow did. I could leave. Take the children. Find work? No." The single word landed like a stone in still water. He turned to face her fully for the first time since the Surrey had left. "You stay," he said. "We hold the land." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. Not relief exactly, but the beginning of certainty. She nodded once. That night, after the children slept, Elias spread the foreclosure notice on the table. They sat across from each other, studying the tight legal print by lamplight. He traced the figures with a calloused finger. Sarah reached out and covered his hand with hers. This time, he did not draw away. They began the next morning. Elias rode to town for the county records. Sarah stayed and mended harness, her needle moving steady while her mind turned over every possible way to raise the money. The children helped where they could, Caleb carrying kindling, Lila sweeping the porch, Thomas content to crawl in the patch of sun that fell through the window. Word moved through the valley the way wind moves through grass, quiet, steady, unstoppable. The McAllisters came first, bringing 2 heifers and a promise to stand witness if it came to court. Then old Mrs. Pedersen arrived with jars of preserves and news that the preacher was already drafting a petition. By week's end, neighbors Sarah had never met were stopping by with offers a day's labor, a sack of flour, the loan of a team. Elias accepted each gift with the same spare nod he gave everything else. But Sarah saw the way his shoulders eased a fraction each time another voice said they would stand with him. The 30 days dwindled. The creek receded, leaving the meadow muddy but intact. Sarah walked it with Elias one evening, the children running ahead chasing meadowlarks. The sun dropped behind the ridge, painting the grass gold. Elias stopped and looked at the house, the barn, the land stretching away under the wide sky. He spoke so low she almost missed it. Never thought I'd have this much to lose. Sarah slipped her hand into his. His fingers closed around hers, rough and warm. Neither did I, she said. The final week arrived like a held breath. Each morning, Sarah woke, counting the days backward, the number shrinking until it felt like sand running through her fingers. Elias rose earlier than usual, riding out to check the boundaries as though the land itself might slip away if he looked away too long. The children sensed the change without being told. Caleb stopped asking to ride with Elias. Lila clung closer to Sarah's skirts, and Thomas fussed whenever either of them left the room. On the 28th day, a rider appeared at the gate. Just after noon. A boy no older than 15, hat in hand, cheeks flushed from hard riding. He carried a sealed envelope and would not dismount until Elias came out to meet him. The boy handed over the letter without a word, then wheeled his horse and left at a gallop. Elias broke the wax in the dooryard. Sarah stood on the porch steps, arms wrapped around herself against the wind that had turned cold again. He read in silence, then folded the paper once and tucked it inside his coat. Court date, he said. Tomorrow. County seat. 10 in the morning. Sarah felt the ground tilt under her. They're moving it up, Crow's lawyer filed for expedited hearing. Claims the flood damaged the collateral value. Wants judgment before the next board meeting. She looked at the house behind her. The patched roof Elias had climbed in sleet to mend, the porch where the children now played with sticks, and string the barn where the borrowed heifers lowed softly. Everything they had built in these months felt suddenly fragile as paper. That night, they packed what little they might need for the journey: clean shirts. For Elias, a dress Sarah had mended until the fabric was thin as hope, blankets for the children. Elias sharpened his razor by lamplight, the scrape of steel slow and deliberate. Sarah sat across from him, folding small clothes with hands that would not stop trembling. If we lose, she said quietly, I won't let them take the children. I'll find a way. Elias set the razor down. We won't lose. He did not say how he knew. He simply said it the way he said the sun would rise or the creek would run again after ice broke. Dawn came gray and still. They loaded the wagon with the children bundled inside, Thomas asleep in Lila's lap. Elias drove reins, steady in his hands. Sarah sat beside him, the foreclosure notice folded in her pocket like a stone. The road to town wound through low hills, still patched with snow, past homesteads, where lamps still burned in kitchen windows. More than once, Sarah saw figures step onto porches to watch them pass McAllister, lifting a hand in salute old Pedersen standing with her arms crossed as though daring the world to take what belonged here. The courthouse stood square and plain brick, weathered by 30 winters. Inside, the air smelled of coal smoke and old paper. The room was already half full when they entered, neighbors seated on the benches, faces familiar, now quiet but resolute. Crow sat at the front table beside a man in a tailored suit, both of them calm as men who have never lost. Elias guided Sarah and the children to seats near the aisle. Caleb sat straight-backed, small fists clenched on his knees. The judge entered, gavel struck once. Papers were read, arguments made. Crow's lawyer spoke smoothly of unpaid notes, compounded interest, legal precedent. He produced documents stamped and notarized, each one another nail. Elias listened without moving, his hat resting on his knee. When the judge called for the defense, Elias stood. He walked to the front, boots deliberate on the pine floor. He did not raise his voice. He spoke of the land, the way a man speaks of bloodkin. 30 years his father had broken it, 30 more he had held it. He spoke of the widow and her children who had come with nothing and stayed to work beside him. He spoke of neighbors who had brought seed and heifers and promises because they knew what it meant to stand together against a winter or a banker. He produced no grand evidence, only receipts for every payment he had ever made on the original loan, every calf sold, every cord of wood cut and hauled to town. He laid them on the table one by one, each small proof of a life lived honestly. Then he looked at the judge and said the simplest thing. This land has never belonged to a bank. It belongs to the people who bleed for it. A murmur moved through the room. Crow's lawyer objected twice. The judge silenced him with a look. Sarah watched Elias return to his seat. His hand found hers under the edge of her shawl and stayed there. The judge recessed for deliberation. 20 minutes passed like 20 years. When he returned, he spoke without flourish. The note is valid, but so is the chain of payments. The foreclosure is denied. The debt stands at $112 payable within 1 year at 5%. Case dismissed. The gavel fell. Crow stood face tight and left without speaking. His lawyer gathered papers with quick, angry motions. Outside, the sun had broken through. Neighbors pressed forward, hands shaken backs, clapped quiet words offered like gifts. Mrs. Pedersen pressed a jar of apple butter into Sarah's hands. McAllister told Elias the heifers were his to keep. Someone started a collection right there on the steps. Coins and folded bills dropped into Elias's hat until it grew heavy. Sarah stood beside Elias while the children ran circles in the thin grass, laughing for the first time in weeks. She felt the ache of the long fear finally loosen its grip. Elias looked down at her. "Home now," he said. She nodded. Home. They drove back under a sky clearing to pale blue, the wagon creaking with the weight of what they carried forward. The land waited, unchanged, creek running clear again, meadow-greening house standing square against the ridge. That evening, Sarah stood on the porch and watched Elias walk the fence line one last time before dark. The children played nearby, Thomas toddling after a butterfly. Elias paused at the gate, looked back toward the house, and raised a hand.
Sarah raised hers in answer.
The wide sky stretched above them, endless and forgiving. The difficult days would come again, drought perhaps, or sickness, or another hard winter. But they would meet them together. No longer strangers, no longer alone. The months after the hearing passed in the slow, sure way of seasons turning over. Summer came hot and dry, the creek shrinking to a thin silver thread between cracked banks. Elias and Sarah worked side by side from dawn until the light failed cutting hay, while the children carried water to the stock and gathered kindling. The heifers McAllister had given them calved in early July, 2 strong heifer calves that Elias helped deliver in the barn while Sarah held the lantern high. When the second one stood on wobbly legs and found its mother's udder, Elias wiped his hands on his pants and looked at Sarah across the straw. Neither spoke. The moment held its own quiet weight. Autumn followed, leaves turning gold on the cottonwoods along the creek. Leela started helping Sarah with the garden, pulling weeds with small, determined hands and learning which plants to leave for seed. Caleb took to riding the old mare Elias had gentled years before. He sat tall now, reins loose, copying the easy way. Elias moved with a horse. Thomas walked everywhere, chubby legs pumping, trailing after anyone who would let him hold a finger. One crisp October evening, Sarah found Elias on the porch after supper, staring at the ridge where the sun had just dropped. He held something small between his fingers, a thin, gold band worn smooth by years. He turned it slowly in the last light. "My mother's," he said when she sat beside him. "She gave it to my father the day they claimed this ground." He gave it back to me the winter he died. Sarah waited. Thought I'd never have use for it, he continued. Thought the land would be all I'd leave behind. She looked at the ring, then at him. The lines around his eyes had softened in these months, not from ease, but from something steadier. He held the ring toward her. If you'll have it. Sarah took it. The metal felt warm from his hand. She slipped it onto her finger. It fit as though it had waited there all along. They did not speak of a ceremony. Frontier life rarely allowed for pomp. The next Sunday, the preacher rode out from town with his wife and a small basket of late apples. Neighbors came without being asked, McAllister's Pedersons, the young couple who had taken the claim 2 miles east. They gathered in the dooryard under a sky so clear it hurt to look at. The preacher read simple words from memory. Elias stood straight, hat in hand. Sarah wore the same mended dress she had arrived in, only now it carried the faint scent of sage and wood smoke instead of train soot. When the preacher asked if she took this man, Sarah looked at Elias and said yes without hesitation. When he asked Elias the same, the answer came low but sure. Rings were exchanged, hers, his mother's, his plain band Elias had bought in town with the last of the hay money. The children stood between them, Lila holding Thomas, Caleb, solemn and proud. After the words were spoken, the preacher smiled and said they were man and wife in the eyes of God in the territory. No one cheered loudly. Instead, there were handshakes, quiet words, a jar of honey pressed into Sarah's hands, a bottle of homemade chokecherry wine passed around in tin cups. The children ran among the grown folks laughing. Someone started a small fire in the dooryard pit. Stories were told, old ones about hard winters survived, new ones about the day the bankman left empty-handed. Elias stayed mostly silent, but once he lifted his cup toward Sarah and met her eyes across the flames. Later, when the visitors had gone and the children slept inside, Sarah and Elias sat together on the porch steps. The night air carried the scent of pine and cooling earth. Stars burned bright overhead. Sarah rested her head against his shoulder. I came here thinking I was saving my children, she said. I didn't know I was saving myself too. Elias put his arm around her. His voice was rough when he answered, sane. They sat a long time in the quiet. The house behind them held the soft sounds of sleeping children. The land stretched out dark and familiar under the moon. Winter would come again, and with it new trials, snow deep enough to bury fences, coyotes bolder in hunger, perhaps another lean year. But the fear that had once lived in Sarah's chest had shrunk to something small and manageable, no longer large enough to drive her away. Elias stood first, offering his hand. She took it and rose. Together they went inside, closing the door against the night. Outside, the wide sky held steady. The ridge stood unchanged. The creek low now still ran. And in the house, a family forged not by blood alone, but by shared labor, shared silence, shared survival, settled into the life they had made. The difficult road continued ahead. They walked it together. Don't be a stranger, partner. Subscribe for more Western legends.